Chapter 28. Happy Tears.
Who am I?
He asked the question as a test to see if he still knew the answer. But of course he did. He just didn't want to say the actual words, not even in thought. He was still himself, but not quite the same person as he was before. He underwent a metamorphosis. Everything had changed, from the way his thoughts were formed to the way he felt the air on his skin. All sensations were foreign, and he was still coming to terms with his new self. Acceptance was a long and arduous road that could only be travelled one step at a time. He learned that lesson from one of his many mothers.
Where am I?
His mind had awoken long before his corporeal vessel was able to catch up. He tried to open his eyes, but his body flat out refused to lend him cooperation. He couldn't move, didn't even have the strength to lift a single finger, but was still able to sense his surroundings. After all, he had spent 29 years as a blind woman in one of his previous lives, and was perfectly capable of perceiving the world without the gift of sight. He heard the popping and crackling of wood somewhere near his feet, most likely coming from a hearth. The warmth it gave off covered him in a comfortable blanket of just about the perfect temperature. Judging from the soft touch of the fabrics underneath his body, he could tell he was lying in a rather luxurious bed. Having that knowledge gave him some sort of reassurance that his team was able to make it to a safer place. At the very least, he wasn't abandoned and left to perish in the cold, cobbled streets of Doriva. Somewhere to his right, about 4 or 5 yards away, he heard a door open and close with a sharp, creaking moan. Someone tiptoed into the room and approached his bedside with utmost care. He could tell even from the faint sound of the footsteps that the floor was made of wood.
Oakwood, to be precise.
A part of him knew with absolute certainty. It likely meant that he wasn't in Doriva anymore, since oaks didn't grow in that region of Aden. Either that, or someone had paid an exorbitant amount of gold to have it imported from afar. He felt the presence of the person that sat down beside him and knew by smell alone that it had to be a woman. Even though it wasn't the fragrance of lemon blossoms, his first thought went to Maya nonetheless. And so did his second thought. And his third one as well. He felt a jolt of excitement hammering his chest, but it still wasn't enough to fuel his body's movement. And then, like a sudden flash of lightning exposing the true face of the night sky, he remembered what happened before he lost his consciousness. The realization took his breath away in a heartbeat.
I almost killed her.
And just like that, he didn't want to open his eyes anymore. Waking up had never seemed like a more terrifying prospect. He wasn't ready to face the shame. He wasn't ready to find out that he had annihilated any chance of becoming a significant part of her life.
She hates me. She has to hate me. How could she not?
Tears were spilling onto his cheeks like a river of flames, melting his face away. Every part of his body hurt, as if thousands of needles were puncturing his skin all at once. But there was nothing that hurt like his heart. No pain could possibly compare to the agony that corroded him from within.
My lord, are you awake?
The voice confused him for a moment. It wasn't one he expected to hear, but it did instantly deliver some much-needed peace to his mind.
Rain,
he tried to say, but only a pitiful whimper escaped his lips.
Shush now. Don't talk,
she said, and hunched over him to wipe the tears from his cheeks. Her touch proved to be the catalyst that finally brought back his ability to move. He immediately tried to scramble himself to an upright position, but a sharp pain in his midriff folded him to a fetal position, leaving him writhing in anguish. His bones felt as if they had been ground to dust. His muscles were barely held together like meat in a slow-cooked stew. Every particle of his body was making him pay for being alive. Even breathing felt like an assault.
You shouldn't move, my lord.
She gently scooped him up by the shoulders and helped him back to a lying position.
Your body has suffered a great deal. It needs time to heal.
Rain,
he finally managed to squeeze out after gathering all his strength. It felt strange to hear his own voice again, like being surprised with a visit from an old friend. He reached out his hand to find her face, but needed her guidance to help him arrive at his destination.
I'm so sorry,
He croaked. His throat was a congestion of sea urchins and cacti, but it was of utmost importance to him that she heard him say it.
For what, my lord?
She sounded genuinely surprised by the apology, and that in return surprised him.
You're crying,
He said and withdrew his hand.
It's all my fault.
Don't be silly, you. These are happy tears.
She sniffled and wiped her cheeks.
Happy tears.
She repeated more assuredly, picked up his hand, and steered it back to her lips so he could discover her smile.
We thought we lost you for good, Lord Cato.
Cato.
He echoed softly, as if hearing a foreign word for the very first time. After a long contemplation in silence, he was ready to accept it as his name. The darkness slowly ebbed away and gradually brought back his vision.
We owe you our lives.
She said solemnly and squeezed tightly into his hand. The touch felt protective, almost motherly even. She gently placed her head on his chest and simply listened to the rhythm of his heartbeat. He winced and bit down on his teeth. Her head felt like an anchor sinking into his ribs, but he suffered through the pain and embraced the moment to the fullest. This kind of intimacy was exactly what Cato Knight needed to feel. His eyes were submerged in a pool of tears. All he saw was a blurry mash of colours.
What is it like?
She suddenly asked. He could feel her words resonating through his chest, rattling his mending heart. It sounded like an easy enough question to answer, but even with the experience of 90 lifetimes, he seemed to lack the words to provide an accurate description.
You don't have to say anything, my lord.
She said after a lengthy silence.
It was a stupid question. I shouldn't have asked.
He chuckled and shook his head, feeling that, at the very least, he owed her an attempt at an answer.
Have you ever had a dream where everything feels so real? You're convinced that it can't be anything else but the only reality that exists? In that dream, you may have a completely different name, appearance, and history, but you never even question your identity in that world. You fully believe that whatever you're experiencing is your life, the only life you've ever lived. There is no reason to think otherwise. You know that it's you.
He paused and was forced to think about all the different lives he had lived through inside his shadow realm. He was dwindling to the depths of his thoughts until Rain reeled him back in with a soft brush on his chest.
But then you wake up.
He continued as if he had never stopped.
All of the sudden, the reality of which you were so sure to be the only in existence cracks and shatters into millions of pieces, and everything that you absolutely knew to be real fades away like a passing thought. But every thought, however insignificant it might seem, holds the power to shape your personality.
He placed his hand on her head and started twirling her hair around his fingers.
That would be similar to what it's like to ingest.
Rain was sobbing quietly into his chest and clumsily wiped her eyes dry on the blanket.
Well, you are still Lord Cato to me.
Rain.
He took a deep breath and swallowed a brick down his throat.
Thank you.
I can't even begin to imagine how agonizing that would be.
She said quietly.
What you must have gone through. You saved us all.
I messed up everything,
He said through gritted teeth, barely able to contain his emotions. His voice was cracking and he had no means to stop his lips from quivering.
Maya.
He took a moment to let the beautiful sound of her name get buried underneath a mountain of guilt.
She will never forgive me for what I did to her.
Don't you say that, Lord Cato.
Rain lifted her head from his chest and stared at him with a sympathetic smile.
Everything will be all right. I'm sure that...
Nothing will be all right,
He barked. The words grated his throat, but he fully accepted the pain. It was no less than he deserved.
I fucked up.
You don't know that.
I don't see how she could forgive me when I can't even forgive myself.
The anger made his blood boil and finally evaporated the fog from his eyes. All of the sudden, his vision returned, and he gained a clear view of a young blonde woman who was hunched over him with a bittersweet expression on her face. His demeanour softened. All anger was subdued in an instant.
You are such a fool, Lord Cato.
She leaned in and gave him a kiss on the forehead.
Lady Maya adores you. It's clear as day, and believe you me, I have a nose for these things.
I have betrayed her trust,
he said, grimacing with heartache. Saying it out loud made him want to retreat to his dark abyss and remain isolated for the rest of his days.
Then win it back!
Her voice cut sharper than any blade. So sharp, it made him flinch.
Win it back.
She repeated, much gentler.
It won't do you any good just feeling sorry for yourself.
I am not.
Yes, you are. Lady Maya is made of much stronger stuff than you give her credit for, you know. Don't presume to know what someone else is willing to forgive, my lord.
He gave her a remorseful look, taken aback by her strong stance on the matter, but quickly realized that she wasn't only talking about Maya.
You are right.
He whimpered and turned his eyes away from her in shame. She stood up from the bed, bent over to brush his hair to the side, and gave him another kiss on the forehead.
We all know that you would never harm us on purpose,
She said, and turned around.
Wait! Are you leaving?
He weakly held onto her wrist, unwilling to let her go. There was a slight panic in his voice. Somehow, he was afraid he would return to the darkness once she disappeared from his sight. She gently freed herself from his grip and smiled.
Don't you worry, my lord. I'll be right back with something for you to eat. You will need the energy to recover. Besides, I need to let everyone know you're awake. I'm sure they will be delighted not having to take orders from Raven anymore. Grant him a shred of authority, and the man thinks he's king, instantly turns into a tyrant.
Raven,
Cato murmured and retreated to his thoughts.
the big bird.
What's that now?
Rain said, struggling to contain her laughter.
Is that some kind of new nickname you gave him?
He wasn't joining in on the laughter and sank his head back into the pillow. His thoughts wandered off as he absently stared at the ceiling that was lavishly decorated with an enormous fresco. His eyes were still too weak to get the image in focus, however.
Where are we, Rain?
She twisted her lips and sat back down by his side. Her eyes showed him pity. It clearly hurt her to see him in such a diminished state.
We are in Valroca, if I pronounce it correctly.
Valroca,
He repeated in a much cleaner Malaki tongue.
the Red Fortress.
Immediately, his mind went back to the final memories of Aunt Goldwing. He made an attempt to bounce upright, completely consumed by anger, but barely had the strength to lift up his neck and screamed out in pain.
Please, my lord, don't overexert yourself.
She hunched over him and neatly tucked him under the blanket again.
You have nothing to worry about. I assure you, we are perfectly safe here. Every nook and cranny has been scrutinized. This place is abandoned.
She paused and seemed hesitant to continue, but ultimately decided the information was too important to withhold.
We have even used our aura as bait.
She paused again to gauge his reaction, but he just kept staring blankly at the ceiling, completely motionless.
There is no one left. Doriva is empty, my lord. Truly empty.
He still didn't give her a response. It stayed silent for a while, with only the flames whooshing in the hearth to keep them company.
We will talk later, all right?
She finally whispered, with the intention not to disturb him any further. She stood up and turned around. The smile on her face vanished in an instant. It wasn't the first time she witnessed him waking up from living through a past life, and even though he did seem to process the aftermath of his so-called ingestion much better this time, she was certain that it was going to take a while before he would return to normal. She vividly remembered the weeks after he had taken Leonid Redmayne's life. The confusion, the sudden outbursts of emotion, the constant self-doubt, the ever-present guilt. She couldn't imagine what it must be like to live through even one life in a matter of seconds, let alone dozens.
I'll be right back, my lord. Don't you go anywhere now.
She tried her best to speak as cheerfully as possible, but was sniffling and weeping as she left the room. Cato never noticed her departure. His eyes were glued to the ceiling as the blurry image gradually started to take shape. He may not have noticed it himself, but a smile had already crawled onto his face when it became clear what the fresco was portraying.
The demise of Dor.
He thought excitedly. There was not a shred of doubt in his mind. The painting showed an image of fire and blood. The first thing that caught his eye was the enormous tree at the center of the ceiling. It was completely white from the veiny roots that bulged from the soil, all the way up to the sharp, claw-like branches that scratched through the clouds. Even the leaves, which resembled large, serrated blades, were painted in the colour of bones. In front of the tree, a massive battle was being fought atop the ashes of Dor's fallen cities. Two figures on the battlefield stood out from the rest. Perhaps not in size or shape, but it was clear that these two were the protagonists of the painting. Even without being able to see any distinguishable features, he recognized one of them in an instant. The seemingly iridescent radiance around the figure was the same as it was in every well-known depiction of her.
Ava Seraphine.
He thought pensively and stared at the brightly glowing figure as if she were a piece of a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. The name sounded strange to him. He had never heard it in full before he knew what Flint Whitelake knew, and was wondering why her familial connection had been omitted from common history. Immediately, his mind trailed off to Maya, but before he was able to form another thought, the figure next to Ava caught his attention and seemed unwilling to let him go. She was shrouded in a cloud of darkness, painted in such a deep black it almost looked like a hole in the ceiling. The longer he stared at the figure, the darker it seemed to become. Slowly but surely, he was getting submerged in the ever-expanding pool of darkness.
Who are you?
His thoughts were no more than a faded echo. His eyes weren't getting heavier, but the darkness completely stole all light from his sight.
Who are you?
Not even Flint, the renowned historian, could tell him the answer. He felt strangely disconnected from everything in the room except for the dark figure on the ceiling. It was a feeling unlike anything he had experienced before, neither in his shadow realm nor in his dreams. Images from a bloody battlefield started flashing in his mind's eye like consecutive lightning strikes. Within those fleeting blinks of clarity, he saw raging waves of fire as tall as castle walls, sweeping across the landscape and scaling an immense white pillar. He heard wails of agony and despair, like a choir of the damned that was accompanied by an orchestra of clanging metals. He smelled a vile miasma of blood, sweat, tears, and whatever else kind of bodily fluids that reminded him of the god-forsaken streets of Doriva. But then he saw her, and all other thoughts evaporated into nothingness, like clouds in front of a blazing sun.
Maya,
he thought, but the thought sounded a million miles away.
Ava,
he said instead in a voice that wasn't his own. The woman who looked exactly like Maya responded with a playful smirk. He could just stare at that face until the end of time.
let's finish what we started, Nyx.
Nyx.
The name echoed in his mind numerous times as the darkness lured him back into the void. The next thing he knew, he was hovering above a fleet of corpses that were floating on an ocean of ink. Black flakes were swirling around him like specks of ash in a storm. The energy that flowed through him felt familiar. He raised his head to the pale tree in front of him and instinctively knew that he was smiling. With a flick of 2 fingers, the black flakes scattered upward into the sky like a swarm of locusts. Slowly, it began to take on the shape of a gargantuan raven, casting an ever-growing shadow that trapped everything it touched in total darkness. All of a sudden, he was back inside the luxurious bedroom. Cold sweat ran down his face like a thawing rooftop. He didn't know how long he had been staring at the fresco, but it felt like he had aged a couple of years during that period of time. His energy was completely drained, and he was forced to take his eyes off the painted ceiling. He rolled his head to the side, expecting to see Rain still sitting next to him, but who he saw instead immediately made his heart skip a beat.
Ava,
He said in thought.
Maya,
He said out loud.